Hello. So in this video, we're going to talk about Ama Ata Aidoo's play Anowa. So Aidoo is one of the most important writers of post-independence Ghana. I've said this in other videos. She, at least according to some people, basically built modern Ghanaian theater. And she's one of the most important and influential African dramatists, one of the most important and influential dramatists in the world. Anowa is a really interesting play because it examines kind of the intersections of two different forms of oppression, or debatably three different forms of oppression. Colonialism, slavery is the other one. You could sort of say colonialism and slavery go hand in hand, because to a certain extent in the play they do, but actually probably safer to say three. So colonialism, slavery, and patriarchy. Anowa, the title character, is a unique and sort of headstrong woman. She marries this guy named Kofi Ako. He is a sort of small-time trader. The marriage is not approved of by Anowa's family, so she leaves on bad terms with them. And basically, she and Kofi Ako go off on their own to do their own thing. The context of these events is that this is the 1870s or so. And so by this point, British control is pretty well established over Ghana. In the opening portion of the play, in the prologue section, we have these two characters who function as narrators. We have an old man and an old woman, called Being the Mouth That Eats Salt and Pepper. That seems to be them as a combined character, but they each have their own distinct personality and distinct take on things. But the old man gives us some of the political context for this. So he says here at one point, "Let not posterity judge it too bitterly that in a dangerous moment the lords of our houses sought the protection of those that came from beyond the horizon, against our more active kinsmen from the north. We only wanted a little peace." So this is sort of the explanation for the Bond Treaty of 1844, which basically gave the British trading rights in parts of what's now Ghana. At the end of that prologue, the old man gives us a more direct sort of context when he says, "It's now a little less than 30 years when the lords of our houses signed that piece of paper, the bond of 1844, they call it, binding us to the white men who came from beyond the horizon." So that idea of European colonialism and capitalism being brought in, because capitalism as a formal economic system was more or less introduced to Africa by European colonialism. That's a central component of this play. These ideas of colonialism and capitalism and the ways in which these are problematic for society and for individuals on an ethical level. Later on, roughly middle of the play, maybe slightly before the middle, we get a fairly direct anti-capitalist and anti-slavery statement from the old man. So I want to give you that, and then we'll talk a little bit more about the adventures of Anowa and Kofi Ako. So the old man says, "Peace creates forgetfulness, and money-making is like a god possessing a priest. He never will leave you until he has occupied you, wholly changed the order of your being, and seared you through up and down. Then only would he eventually leave you, but nothing of you except an exhausted wreck, lying prone and wondering who you are. Besides, there must be something unwholesome about making slaves of other men, something that's against the natural state of man and the purity of his worship of the gods. Those who have observed have remarked that every house is ruined where they take in slaves." So obviously this is an anti-capitalist, anti-slavery stance, it's also important in terms of what it tells us about the detrimental impact on the individual of capitalist greed and on the household of owning slaves. Because Anowa and Kofi Ako they start out as very small-time traders, they're carrying skins from town to town in order to sell them. They are personally carrying them. Their clothes are very threadbare. Their food is very basic and not very good, etc., etc. Kofi Ako says basically that he wants to buy a couple of slaves in order to help with this work so that they can make more money. And Anowa is deeply opposed to this, despite the fact that her society accepts the owning of slaves. She believes it's fundamentally immoral. And this is an interesting thing. This is a worthwhile thing, because often people who want to excuse US racial inequality, and this is, again, my personal perspective as an American, that's not necessarily central to Aidoo's project in her Ghanaian context, but in the US, people who often want to excuse racial slavery and the ongoing inequality created by that even to this day will often point to the fact that Africans owned slaves as well, that other people in other historical contexts have generally at some point or another in their history had slaves, etc., etc. This is definitely true. One big difference that I think is important is that in Africa, in, say, Persia, in the ancient world, in China, in any of these other sort of ancient world contexts and things like this in which slavery was practiced, slavery was not race-based in most of those contexts. And that's a significant difference, because the type of inequality that's created when you say this race is inferior or this race is a slave race is different than the kind of inequality that exists when you say this individual is a slave. Theoretically, they could become free. They could no longer be a slave. But when there is an element of racial inequality built into the mix, that is a huge difference. So that's worth keeping in mind. But that's not really what Aidoo is dealing with here. Because, again, there is this element of the capitalist character, Kofi Ako, the one who is driven to gain as much money and comfort as he can. He is the one who says we should get slaves. And Anowa keeps saying, no, we shouldn't. Slavery is fundamentally wrong. And so we have that ethical dilemma between them. As time goes on, Kofi Ako becomes richer and richer. He has more and more slaves and more opulent house, etc., etc. Anowa, on the other hand, never changes her clothing. She wears the same fairly ragged garb that she's always worn. She goes barefoot throughout the whole thing. She becomes sort of more wizened, more run down as the play goes on, whereas Kofi Ako becomes more opulent and decadent because he is indulging in the benefits, such as they are, of slavery and capitalism. Anowa gives us a really interesting dream. She narrates a dream that she's had that really sort of brings home why she has this horror of slavery, and I think it's a really important component of it. In part because it also helps us to start to understand why she is declining, why she is coming apart at the seams, as it were. So she says here, she narrates this lengthy conversation she had had with her grandmother, where the grandmother, Anowa is asking questions about the white men, about slavery, about the taking of people from what was then called the Gold Coast, which is now Ghana and other parts of West Africa. Anowa is asking all of these questions. The grandma doesn't want to answer them. She's basically saying, stop asking so many questions, etc., etc. But she tells Anowa the answers to the questions. And so Anowa then reflects, that night I woke up screaming hot, my body burning and sweating from a terrible dream. I dreamt that I was a big, big woman, and from my insides were huge holes out of which poured men, women, and children. And the sea was boiling hot and steaming. And as it boiled, it threw out many, many giant lobsters, boiled lobsters, each of whom, as it fell, turned into a man or woman, but keeping its lobster head and claws. And they rushed to where I sat and seized the men and women as they poured out of me, and they tore them apart and dashed them to the ground and stamped upon them. And from their huge courtyards, the women ground my men and women and children on mountains of stone. But there was never a cry or a murmur, only a bursting as of a ripe tomato or a swollen pod, and everything went on and on and on. And I think this is a horrendous but very apt sort of explanation of the ethos of the slave trade, the ethos of taking people from Africa to the Western Hemisphere, the Americas, Caribbean, etc., to enslave them, and basically destroying whole massive groups of people in the interests of exploiting their labor. And so this is Anowa's deep and visceral revulsion to the idea of slavery. And I think that's a really interesting perspective, because Anowa is often criticized in this play because she does not want to just conform to what her husband says. Particularly the old woman who is one of the narrators with the old man is very, very critical of Anowa. But I actually think we're supposed to see Anowa as ethically more right than Kofi Ako, who again believes in slavery, believes in keeping people as slaves. But then ultimately at the end, Kofi Ako wants to send Anowa away. He wants to more or less get a divorce. And he refuses to tell her why. So she is actually like trying to make this an issue. She calls in all the slaves and is basically like, has any of you ever heard of a man who wants to divorce his wife but won't tell her why? And they're like, no. So she sends for all these wise people to get their opinions, etc., etc. But then she works it out. You remember how the old man in that one portion had said of the spirit of money making, but nothing of you except that the spirit of money making will eventually leave you, but nothing of you except an exhausted wreck lying prone and wondering who you are? Kofi Ako is impotent. That's the conclusion that Anowa comes to. Kofi Ako never denies it, and so I think we're supposed to take that to be accurate. There is disagreement among some of the characters and among the community about why exactly Kofi Ako has become impotent. Some people, like the old woman, believe that Anowa is a witch who has cursed him or sapped his strength or something like this. But Anowa says that he has exhausted his masculinity acquiring slaves and wealth. So basically this is sort of the idea. And I think this is, again, what we're supposed to believe from this play, is that the pursuit of money, the pursuit of slaves, the pursuit of goods and luxuries and things like this is what has drained Kofi Ako of his virility, of his masculinity, and that this is what has prevented them from ever having children.